Each year, more than 46 million Americans will seek emergency room treatment for an accidental injury, most of which are preventable. So, what are your risks, and who can you trust to protect you? This is Safety Matters with Russ Kenzior.
This is America's slip and fall guy, Russ Kenzior. Welcome to Safety Matters.
And this is Tony B. Good morning.
Well, Tony, as usual, we are going to start out with
Safety Matters in the news.
And what do you think's in the news?
Coronavirus.
No, go figure. Yeah, this one's an interesting story, though. We've been kind of covering this for a while about Texas physicians and the coronavirus tests and the positivity rates that are not even being done.
I know.
Well, there's a story out by the Texas Tribune this past week that's entitled, "Texas Physicians Are Losing Money During the Pandemic, and They Want Lawmakers to Make Health Insurers Pay Up," meaning the health insurance industry. Texas primary care doctors say they're hemorrhaging cash and at a risk of closing their doors during the coronavirus pandemic. And a new trade group proposal argues it's time for Texas lawmakers to overhaul how physicians get paid. It goes on to say more patients are foregoing office visits as they stay home to avoid the virus, and doctors' offices report that their revenues have fallen sharply as a result. In fact, up to 50%. Many large health insurance companies have posted huge profits during the same period. So there's a lot of people making money on the insurance side, but not on the doctor's side.
The people that are doing the work.
Yeah, and it goes on to say the physicians group, this new group, which represents nearly 10,000 members, is also asking for other reforms, such as new state laws to make it easier for physicians to get paid for seeing patients via telemedicine. I don't know if you've been doing any telemedicine, but that seems to be very popular, where you don't actually go in to see your doctor. You just go online, and I guess it's kind of like a Zoom call. So they're calling on, the group is calling on Texas legislature to expand the Medicaid public insurance program to cover poor adults, which would lower the state's uniquely high uninsured rate and increase the number of paying customers at doctors' offices. But payment reform is their number one demand. These doctors want payment reform. And the new proposal is calling for state-governed health plans to move away from traditional fee-for-service payment models. And under the new system, the mainstream in American medicine physicians bill insurance companies based on discrete services they provide, such as office visits, lab tests, or immunization. So they're wanting kind of a flat fee. The doctors instead, again, want this, and I'm quoting, want insurance companies to embrace a prospective payment model in which insurers pay physicians a set fee per patient each month, akin to kind of like a subscription service. So it's kind of like your cable.
This corona stuff it's just killing this country.
It really is changing every aspect of our life.
It's not killing any people anymore. It's just killing business.
Yeah, it's really killing profits.
Yes.
The story goes on to say some 8% of U.S. doctors reported shuttering their practices in the past 4 months because of the coronavirus. According to an August survey published by the nonprofit Physicians Foundation, more than 40% reported cutting staff. So in the greatest need for medical professionals, right, we're seeing them go out of business and cut their staffs.
True story. A friend of ours in Austin had a son that's going to medical school, and he's almost like at the point where he wants to drop out. He says, why am I going to go into this profession?
Yeah. Kind of like cops.
Oh, my goodness.
Who wants to be a cop? There's so much pressure and just angst in the profession, and we need it more than anybody. We need it more than anything.
Absolutely.
But very sad news. Again, this is a unintended consequence of the coronavirus shutdown. We also have been talking quite a bit about hand sanitizers.
Right.
And the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, announced this week that it's providing a form of laboratory testing to help grade the quality of hand sanitizer products that are about to go onto the market. Because, they've been recalling many different products in the past because they didn't work.
Yeah, over 100.
150.
Wow.
Actually, I think according to this report, it's over 165. But they go on, and this is from CleanLink. The purpose of testing is to verify that the hand sanitizers feature all the ingredients necessary to function and don't contain dangerous amounts of impurities, according to the FDA. These testing methods help to assess hand sanitizers featuring ethanol, isopropanol, and 2-propanol, which is an active ingredient. By testing for impurities, the exams should be able to identify methanol contamination. That's the bad one, which has been issued as has been an issue for the FDA, which has identified 165 hand sanitizers that they deem to be dangerous for public use since this late spring. But here's the catcher. While some hand sanitizers are being shunned, that's a word we used last week, right? Shunned. It's possible that others could begin to be embraced. A study shows, not certain what the study is, but there is a study that shows that one manufacturer's line of non-alcohol, paraben-free, and vegan hand sanitizers, vegan hand sanitizer is capable of killing 99.999% of germs.
Well, that's good.
Reports a Canadian manufacturer. So, time for standards, huh?
Yes.
And, it's funny, when we talk about standards, most people are really confused, like, what is a standard? What's a code? What's a ordinance? What's a law? What's a guideline? Just about everything we come in contact with today in our average day is made to be compliant with some type of, industry standards, recognized codes, regulations, guidelines.
So what is a code?
Well, that's a good question. What exactly are these codes? How are they formed? And I thought, it would take a minute here to explain to the audience a little bit about the process of standardization. Codes and standards serves pretty much as the rules of the road. We all rely upon them.
Right.
And they this benefits everybody. It's a common good for our community and our country. But we take them for granted. And let's be honest, Tony, we don't understand how they're developed, and we take them for granted. So when you get on a plane or get in a car, you assume, or the food you drink, right? You assume that it's being
looked at and watched over.
Yeah, and we realize times where that has been a failure. For example, August 1st, 2007, you may remember this, the collapse of the I-35 bridge in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which killed 13 people, injured 145, and according to the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, investigation, it was found that the probable cause of the collapse was, quote, due to the inadequate load capacity due to a design error of the bridge's gusset plates, which failed because of the weight on the bridge, end quote. It's believed that there are thousands, Tony,
oh my goodness,
of bridges nationwide that need a repair replacement. Our infrastructure
needs to be rebuilt.
Not in compliance with the codes, right? Not in compliance with the standards. Or how about this one? You remember back in February of 2003, the West Warwick, Rhode Island Station nightclub fire?
Oh yeah, I do remember that.
100 people died. The other 230, including the great white guitarist Ty Longley. Remember that died in the fire. Fire was caused by pyrotechnics set off by the tour manager on the evening's headlining band's debut, which ignited flammable acoustic foam in the walls and ceilings surrounding the stage and reached this flashover point. So it was a fire hazard, causing all the combustible materials to burn. Created a lot of smoke, and they said within about 5.5 minutes, it was pretty much
over.
So again, another violation of, in this case, the fire code.
Right.
And so you say, well, how are these codes, done? Most of these types of disasters are preventable, and needless to say, were in violation of these published standards and codes. Sadly, most people are completely uninformed as to what's going on and how does this work. So I'm going to spell out the process. There's most standards developing organizations, or SDOs. Organizations like ASTM, you may see these on product labels, ANSI, ANSI, or in our case, the National Floor Safety Institute, or NFSI. They go through this consensus development process, and it's relatively simple. An SDO, a standards developing organization, establishes these committees, and they bring in different stakeholders, people from the community that have a stake in the development of a standard. The members of the committee pay a membership dues, they participate, and they range in sizes for like 25 to 100 people generally serve on these committees. Some are really big and some are relatively small. The committee is governed by what's called operating procedures, and that's, again, rules of the road for how the committee goes about creating standards. And every one of these committees is overseen by an individual called the committee secretary or secretariat. And so you have a standards developing organization creates a committee. The committee has a leader called the secretary. And if you're not on the committee, outside parties, individuals are encouraged to participate in the process by providing public review comments. So if you don't like what's going on or you have questions, you can submit comments. You don't have to be a member of the committee. If a party objects to a standard that's about to be published, they are provided an opportunity to appeal the standard. And then after the committee has voted to approve the standard and all outstanding appeals have been addressed, the standard is published. And now you have a national standard. So that's kind of how they work. That's kind of the standards process. And again, the word consensus standard. Consensus doesn't mean everybody. It doesn't mean unanimity. It just means majority. So it's the majority vote. Coming up on the next segment, we're going to be talking to a standards developing organization, or SDO, the National Fire Protection Association. And fire safety is a big deal.
It is.
And so we're going to be speaking with Jim Pauly, President and CEO of the NFPA, when Safety Matters returns. Back to Safety Matters. This is Russ Kenzior, and I've been talking about standards, safety standards in particular. And for most of you, you might think, gosh, what a boring subject. Well, it may be, but don't forget, standards play an important role in protecting each and every one of us every day. From the car you drive, to the bridge you drive over, to the building you work in, and the home you go home to, standards play a very important role in protecting the health and safety of all Americans. In fact, standards is what makes the United States the safest country on earth. But they come in all different shapes and sizes and have different levels of importance. Well, one of the oldest standards developers is the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA. Fire standards were brought about by great fires in Chicago and New York and other major cities, and again serve to protect the general public. Joining me today is the NFPA President and CEO, Jim Pauly. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Russ. It is great to be here.
Most people really don't know who the NFPA is or understand anything about the fire code. Only hear about it when they see a major fire on television where, results in the loss of life, property damage, or like what's going on the West Coast now with the forest fires. If you could take a minute and tell us about the NFPA.
Yeah, so it's, as you mentioned, we're about almost 125 years old. We actually got our start doing standards for what was the insurance industry was really the driver. And around Boston, there were about sprinkler systems were becoming popular in the industrial buildings at that time. And we actually doing a great job at reducing loss, but way too many ways, different ways to install them. Some ways work better than others. And the insurers were saying, we need some standards around this. So we sort of got put together and assembled the very first standard on automatic sprinkler systems called NFPA 13. It still exists today. Since that time period, we developed more than 300 different codes and standards. We developed the National Electrical Code, which is probably one of the most widely used construction-related documents really in the world. And we also do standards, but across a wide array of things. Our Life Safety Code talks about exits in the building. Do standards for the fire service. Their standards on their gloves, their PPE, their SCBA, their helmets, all of the health and safety in the fire service. We have standards that cover all of that. So we have a pretty wide breadth of things that we do today.
Well, one of the standards that you author that I'm very familiar with is the NFPA 101 Life Safety Code, which is germane to my business in the area of walkway safety. But you also provide a wide range of training programs and actually have a certification program, don't you?
We do some personnel certifications that we have. We have a certification for a certified fire protection specialist. A certified fire inspector is another example. We do some certified life safety specialists in some specialty areas. That area of credentialing, really, of people is a growing area that we have. We also do training around our standards and around the topics that we cover. And I think probably for some of your audience, when they think in terms of, wow, NFPA, where have I kind of heard that? We also do a lot of public education. So Sparky the fire dog is our official mascot. Sparky belongs to us. If you remember from sort of our age bracket back to Dick Van Dyke doing stop, drop, and roll or crawl, those were all our messages, right? They were developed out of NFPA to help try to keep people safe from fire and teach people about fire safety.
Wow, the Dick Van Dyke Show. We're kind of dating ourselves here. You know, it's my view that most people probably associate the NFPA to being a government regulator. You're part of the federal government, state government, and that the fire code is actually a governmental agency that mandates certain fire standards, when in fact you're an independent organization. You're not part of the government, but you author standards that have been widely adopted by governmental entities, state, local, townships, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, you're not a government regulator. You're an independent organization. And I think there's some people that have a little bit of confusion about how do your standards actually intersect with the government.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's important is to recognize that we describe ourselves as a voluntary private sector standards organization. And why is that important? We're not funded by the government. We're not, we don't get, people don't hand us piles of money. Yes, we do have membership, but in reality, our membership is separate from our standards development process. Our members are mostly people that are just interested in fire safety and interested in carrying the fire safety message, and we can help support that. So everything that we do as an organization, we have to generate revenue to make that happen. And as you mentioned, selling codes and standards is one of the key ways that we generate that revenue. But what goes into that? So in our case, we have almost 9,000 participants throughout our standards process that sit across a large different variety of committees. And, people often think of, we always get accused of, we're located up just outside of Boston on a hillside, and people are like, you guys up on the hillside just write this stuff. We just make it up out of the blue. And I always laugh because I said there are 300 people in the world that can't actually do anything to change or propose to an NFPA standard. And those 300 people all work for me at NFPA. Staff is not permitted to actually be the authors of the standards. So we do that from outside folks. For us, think of people on our committees that are, I'll use the electrical code. It's the electrical installers. It's the electrical inspectors. It's the home builders that are on that committee. It's the big industrial users. It's the insurers. It's the testing labs. It's the utility companies. All different walks of that industry, right, are involved. And so I think one of the misconceptions people go, the manufacturers just write these things. That's not true. In our process, out of all those groups I described to you, in a committee, no one of those interests can have more than 1/3 of the committee, and it takes 2/3 of the committee to pass anything. So the idea that the manufacturers control it is impossible because they don't get enough votes. It's not permitted by our process to control it. Now, why is that important? Because we talk about consensus-based standards. That committee of experts, these are people that live and breathe this stuff in their jobs, come together and arrive at the best consensus to solve a particular fire problem, electrical problem, life safety problem. And I'll give you some example when you talk about it being expensive. For our national electrical code, we have 2 steps to our process: public input, public comment, right? For the public input phase, for I think our 2017 edition, there were 21,000 plus hours of committee meetings that occurred. For our second stage in that process, there were 18,000 plus hours of committee meetings that had to occur. It takes staff. It takes time. You've got to have a hotel somewhere. You've got to have meeting rooms where these things go on. You've got to have my staff that has to be there. Then behind that, we've got editors that have to take all the material and actually turn it into something. You've got publishing, printing. All of that costs money. But the system that the U.S. has in place, and it's also true in other parts of the world, distributes that cost widely through the sale of the standards. So an electrician buys a code book, an engineer buys a code book, right? The inspection department has a code book. So the costs get distributed. It's not taxpayer dollars. And I think that's a big misconception that people have. Our standards are not government standards. They are voluntary standards that sit on a shelf. What's happened over the decades is government has went, wow, we're supposed to keep people safe. I'll use your life safety code as the example. By the way, the life safety code came out of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that occurred in New York, killed 70 plus people because there were exits in the building. But out of that, government says, wow, I need to find a way to protect folks. So what do? I could write all these rules myself. And I think we would all agree that's not government's best use of time at assembling wide variety of people, coming to consensus on stuff, and actually being able to publish things, right? It's just not what they do day in and day out. So they turned and went, hey, there's a private sector standard that does exactly what we want it to do. We're going to adopt that standard and say, when you build this building, you need to comply with that standard, and that's how we're going to keep people safe. What's happened now is people have said, oh, well, because the government's now said they're going to use it, the standard should just be free. And that's a problem. It upends the entire system that's in place, because if you make it free, I generate revenue from it. That's how I have 21,000 hours of committee meetings, right? If you make it free, I'm out of business. You're going to be out of business. Standards developers are not going to do standards. And I just want people to think about, what would your world look like if standards didn't exist? Right? And sometimes it's hard for people to imagine, but I think you can imagine if you walk into your house, there's no light switches to turn the lights on. Why are those light switches, at the doors and at the locations where they are? Well, because the code said they're going to be installed there. Why do you have receptacles you can plug into? Because the code said they're going to be installed there, right? Why do you have ground fault circuit interrupters to protect you from getting shocked in your bathroom? Because the code says that they're going to be there. All of that goes away. And now suddenly it becomes the lowest common denominator. I'll build you a house with one light switch, and 3 receptacles.
Welcome back to Safety Matters. This is Russ Kenzior, and I'm speaking with Jim Pauly, President and CEO of the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, about fire codes, fire prevention standards, and how they apply to each and every one of our lives. The fire code goes back over 100 years and plays a vital role in construction standards. If you could, Jim, explain to our audience a little bit about codes and standards.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to think about standards. One is without trying to get nuanced about codes versus standards, in the technical definition, we do both. We have the National Electrical Code, we have the Life Safety Code, we have the National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code, and then we have these bunch of things that we call standards. Development-wise, they're exactly the same, right? We develop them through the same process. We use language in them that has mandatory language. So if you're going to decide to use the standard, it says, well, you shall do this, right? But your exact point about them being voluntary. So what happens to them? Well, as I mentioned before, a government somewhere says, well, we shouldn't just let people install electrical systems any way that they want, and it could be unsafe. So we're going to require that people use the National Electrical Code. Now, that's government's decision to require people to comply with that. I have no enforcement authority for my standards. There's nothing I can do to make somebody follow my standard. I think the second way that standards really get used, and the second and the third way, fire department you mentioned, often standards will get used to purchase things. Fire department will say, if we're going to purchase a new apparatus, a new fire truck, it needs to be compliant to NFPA 1901. That's the fire department's decision to get a piece of equipment, right, that's compliant to a standard. Then the third way is what I often refer to as sort of standards of care. We are, in many cases for our standard, we're sort of assumed to be the de facto, quote unquote, national standard because we do these things to cover these. So why do people follow them on their own? Well, I'm an electrical engineer by background. I'm going to design a system. I want to make sure I'm using the latest standards and the latest thinking that's went into those to do my design. And then if something down the road and something goes wrong, it's important for me to be able to say, I used the national standards that were involved. I didn't wander off on a path on my own. I didn't make stuff up, right, to do this. So the standard of care in these becomes important. Real quick example in the electrical field, we have a standard called NFPA 70E. It's an electrical safety standard for workers in the workplace. In other words, how do I keep safe working around electrical equipment? Now, that standard is, in most cases, decided to be used by a contractor. He's like, I'm going to make my people follow and train to this standard because it keeps them safe. Insurers may say, you follow that standard, I'm going to give you better, insurance rates for your folks because you are following a set of standards. So there are a lot of ways that they can be used. This idea that because government gets involved, it somehow changes all of that development, all of that cost is just a false assumption. Government has said, we're being pretty smart, taxpayer, by deciding to use something that exists instead of spending a whole bunch of your money to develop this ourselves.
It only makes sense that the fire code and the electrical code be harmonized and be written by the same organization, by many of the same people, because electricity oftentimes is directly related to fires. And so it makes a lot of sense. And every business person is familiar with having the fire marshal come into their business to check their fire extinguishers, exit lights, alarms, etc. I certainly have had that type of inspection take place at my office. But tell us a little bit about the fire department and how the codes work within a local fire department, whether it be city, county, township, etc.
Okay, so you mentioned the fire department, and so let's kind of start there and work outwards. Every day you go into a business, in COVID times you're not going into them quite as much as you used to, but if we can remember back to that time, we were all going into businesses. How do I know when I go into that business that I can be in there and I can have a meal if it's a restaurant, or I can do things and expect as a member of the public to be safe? Well, fire departments do inspections of those businesses, and they inspect them to the fire code. What do they look at in that fire code? NFPA 1 is our fire code. They look at things like making sure the exits are not blocked, making sure they're not locked during business hours, making sure they have an adequate number of exits, making sure they're not over capacity, right? If that label that says capacity 75, right, is that what they're structured and arranged for? Making sure that their kitchen exhaust system has a fire extinguishing system in it, so if they had a kitchen fire. So the public's being kept safe behind the scenes. If we do this right, the public never knows what's really happening behind all of that. So extend on beyond that a little bit. So, worst thing you can imagine, but you have a fire, right? What does that mean? Well, number one, what materials were used in the building of your home or in the construction of that business, right? Did that fire spread more rapidly than what it did before? I'm going to give your listeners a really interesting set of statistics. And because one of the things we talk a lot about is home fire sprinklers. In 2 decades ago, if you had a home fire, it took about 17 minutes for enough fire to build up to get to what we call flashover, which means the space is untenable. Because building materials have changed, because open space designs, because we put more plastic-based products in the home, flashover today is occurring in 3 to 4 minutes. It takes 9 minutes for the fire department to get there if they're complying with the standard. So why is it important that people think in terms of fire prevention and they think in terms of how do I keep a fire from happening? Because those are this trickling set of events that are going to go on. But when that fire department shows up, they're in an apparatus that meets a standard. They're using tools that meet a standard. Their breathing apparatus meets a standard. How they attack the fire meets a set of standards. That ladder that they use meets a set of standards. So even those folks that are on the front lines doing that dangerous job are able to be a little bit safer in what they do because of standards for what they wear and how they do their work. It is still a dangerous job, right? They're running in when we're all running out. But that's an example along that chain of standards playing a role in every one of those things that I just described that happen.
Aside from the fire department, firemen, fire marshals, et cetera, there are many other people who rely upon fire codes, fire standards, electrical codes, electrical standards, et cetera. And in the world of litigation and safety, these standards, these codes, oftentimes represent what's known as the standard of care, meaning what should be done by a reasonable property owner to ensure the safety and health of the public. And so setting forth and using standards is somewhat complex because they're written to be used by many different types of people, including attorneys, which, as I mentioned, use standards to establish the standard of care. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, I think that is a fair statement, and I think that's another important reason why even professionals, even outside of government, saying I'm going to require that you follow this standard, it's even why professionals go, I want to make sure I'm doing things by the standard, because it is, at some point, somebody's going to say, did you follow that set of rules that have been established by sets of experts who are knowledgeable in the field, right, across the spectrum of things, that said this is an important way to do this. So it does play a role. One of the biggest ones that we see, by the way, we do a standard called NFPA 921 on fire investigations. It's a guide to fire investigations. And that group of experts is a phenomenal group of experts. They do fire investigations all over. That standard is often used in court when there is a fire that occurs and it's been investigated, or cause and origin of the fire. A lot of arson cases that use that. It's become, the reference, and actually the global reference in many cases, around fire investigations and the guide that people use. So it happens so much outside of the public eye that, and that's been okay. Right, I've said that before, that the public sort of takes it for granted, and that's been all right. Now when people start saying, oh, you guys, we're going to just take all of your standards and make them free, the public not understanding the system is not okay anymore, because they're going to be impacted. If I can't pay my employees and I can't pay my bill, I'm going to go away, right? So who's going to do the standards?
You raise an excellent point. In the world of standards developing organizations, there's a fairly diverse group. Organizations like NFPA, NFSI, ASTM, ANSI, et cetera. And some of those are actually comprised of product manufacturers. And the last thing you want, in my opinion, is product manufacturers actually authoring safety standards. Why? Well, because of self-interest. Needless to say, if you allow the fox in the hen house, damage will be done. And we see it every day in corporate America, where companies will bend the rules to benefit themselves and the profit margin, and that doesn't always take into account as a primary motive the health and safety of the general public. We'll continue this conversation with Jim Pauly, President and CEO of the National Fire Protection Association, when Safety Matters returns. back to Safety Matters. This is Russ here, speaking with Jim Pauly, President and CEO of the National Fire Protection Association. Jim, there's been a recent and an ongoing legal dispute, regarding the use and publication of industry standards where, because the government had somehow recognized a particular standard, in the case of the NFPA, the fire code, that somehow the government thinks that standard should be provided for free to anybody that wants it. And that, of course, raises a massive problem as it relates to funding the process by which standards are created. So there's, again, this conflict between private industry, standards developers like yourself and others, and the federal government. Tell us a little bit about what is going on in that arena.
Yeah, so it's went on for quite some time. I think where things really changed is as the internet and the information age through the internet really came to light. So people just decided that they would take the standards information, which for us and other standards developers is copyrighted information, because again, we take that, we sell that as the standard, and that's how we generate revenue. And people would take those and just post them on the internet for free. And so as we begin to challenge that under the copyright, people what the response was is that, since governments adopted them, that's the law, and you can't copyright the law. And I'm like, well, it wasn't the law until government decided that they wanted to do something with it. My standard is still my standard, right? So the challenges that are going on today are around that very issue of copyright. The proponents of this have nothing to do with the user of the standard, have nothing to do with the development of the standard. They have to do with this sort of general idea that, well, because there's an internet, information that's on the internet should just be free. And, that runs counter in so many ways, not just standards, but in so many ways of people trying to be able to protect their intellectual property rights and be able to generate revenue. And one of the arguments for that was, well, if the public's required to follow it, they need to be able to know what it says. Now, you already mentioned for the vast majority of cases, the public could care less, right? They're not going to sit down and read a standard. But I will tell you, for NFPA, all 300 plus of our codes and standards that we develop are on our website. They are available to read for free from cover to cover. You can't download them or you can't print them, but they are available for anybody anywhere in the world to be able to read for free, right? So the idea that, the public doesn't have access is just simply not true in our particular case. So there have been, there are a number of legal challenges that are underway. There have been some. There was one in the Southern District of New York just recently about some standards that were taken by somebody else that belonged to a developer, and they did some other stuff with them and posted them on the internet. And this is really the challenge that's being made to the entire system. And my answer to folks is, so what do you propose as the alternative? Nobody can answer that question. What they say to us as a standards developer is, well, you should just figure out some other way to generate your revenue.
Well, that's easy to say, but unrealistic. There is a cost for everything. And if you are in the business of developing standards, then there has to be some means by which to offset the cost to produce standards and to make a modest profit. Because after all, what would be the incentive to want to do that? But I'm very troubled when I hear about the counterfeiting issue. This is something that one would never really expect would be taking place in the standards development industry.
We've seen, right, can you believe it? I mean, people think in terms of counterfeit. I'm thinking of the Gucci handbag or Ray-Ban sunglasses, right? That's what people are counterfeiting. No, people are counterfeiting standards. Our electrical code is a good example. We've seen the market flooded with actual counterfeit copies. We are the only people that print that document. We sell it through numerous folks, right? But we're the only people that print that document. And suddenly documents start showing up with pages that are missing, with text that is incorrect. with poor quality on that, which people then just assume is poor quality on our part that occurs. Who would have guessed that you would counterfeit standards? But that's exactly what people are doing. They find cheap places to print overseas. They get them in bulk and they sell them through outlets like Amazon, which is of significant concern on top of this. So and now stack. I want to take away your copyright. Stack that on top of the people that are already violating the copyright and counterfeiting the standard and creating the errors. And now look at the system that you're going to end up with people going, I thought I followed the standard, but it turned out not to be the language that the actual standard was.
I would think that for most of our listeners, they would associate intellectual property theft, trademark theft, to be really just specific to the high-tech industry, Apple, Google, software manufacturers, maybe the federal government, Department of Defense, other areas of the government where there's sensitive secrets that would be very much desired by foreign national companies. But you've raised a really good point, and really want to thank you for coming on today's show, and would love to have you back someday. So thanks for joining the program today, Jim.
Russ, I appreciate that, and thanks for getting the word out about standards. Again, can often be a dry topic for a lot of folks, but they do affect us every day in everything that we really touch and we do. And I appreciate you getting the public more informed about the importance of that to our quality of life and to our economy.